That's it.
Our kid is
Is that thermos now 84?
It's an important quiz on the board if you can't name every evangelist in the relocation. I don't know what that will say.
Can you do it? Is it enough from both of us?
From my notes or from my head?
Can you do it?
I'm sure I can get most of them right. Somebody down in Brazil, somebody in Germany.
14, can you get all 14?
Somebody in Brooklyn in there?
Don't remember, you forget, what's his name?
20% have the last name.
Yes, if I can start with all. I'm almost there. Okay, I'm going to start. Thinking about this number, Sunday morning we ended up with almost 3 times this number by the time we finished. But I'll give you the opportunity to hear the introduction. So here are the thought questions. Hopefully you have, I have at least one extra copy of the, actually I want to hang on to it. I have the deacon's duties up here as well, but that second question, I hope we get to that. I feel like I'm missing a good opportunity to relate some of those duties back to the purpose. And I haven't been doing that as much as I said we would do it. But if we do tonight, I think you'll see some very specific things that are done related to spreading the gospel. But we'll come back to those questions as we go along. The title of the class, again, we're taking a look at what the Church of Christ really is. And we're down to the purpose. And we're moving on. We've already talked about the inward purpose. Now we're going to begin to talk about the outward purpose. If you had to put one word to an outward purpose of the church, what would your one word be for that purpose? Yes, evangelism. Okay. And we'll use that. We'll talk about it in that way. But I do want us to think about the fact that much of what the church does is inwardly focused, to build us up, to edify us, to strengthen us, but also to equip us for some work. And so I want to be careful about leaving the idea that these purposes can be totally examined all by themselves and they don't have a relationship with each other. And I hope you'll see as we begin to look at the next two purposes how they are connected with one another. All three have a relationship. But these are the goals. And if you look at goal number 4, we've been especially paying attention to that, the challenge for each one of us to become more active in our involvement with the church here. But this time I've moved ahead and highlighted the idea of telling others about Christ. So we've been talking the last 3 lessons about our efforts to stir one another up to love and good works. We'll put a little more emphasis in tonight as far as our goal goes of talking about how we're going to tell others of Christ. And there's a role, there's something that you can be doing here in all of this. All right, so before we really begin to dig into it, I've asked Andrew if he would lead us in prayer before the class gets started. If you don't mind, Andrew. Thank you.
God, our great, wonderful Father in heaven, we thank you for this day that you've given us, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity we have to come together tonight, to study together, to be with one another, to build up one another and encourage each other. We thank you for us in teaching this class. We ask that we all be able to pay attention and be able to add and teach others throughout this class as well. Lord. It's in your son's name we pray.
Okay, I've got 4 passages here, and I don't want to divide you up into groups, but I would like to give you each an assignment of one of these verses, and I want you to look it up, and I'm going to give you a couple of questions here. And so Ken back here to Blaine, including Chester, if you guys can look at the first passage. And Ken, if Chester needs it up, if you don't mind reading it to him,
Sure.
that would help him. And then Steve, Andrew, and the Cohens, if you'll take 1 Peter 2, 11 through 12. We're not going to be consistent with the size group, but the last 2 rows on this side. If y'all take 1 Peter 3, verse 15. And then everybody forward all the way up to Teresa, if y'all look at Acts 8, 1 through 4. Here's what I want you to be looking at. You can see the idea of personal lights. That's what Matthew 5 is going to talk about. We want to look at 2 ways in which the church can fulfill the mission of outwardly looking toward influencing the world and teaching the world. These passages, I think, all talk about us as individuals being involved in doing that work. So I want you to look at the passage that you've been given and try to find something that talks about individual responsibility. It's saying to you personally, do this. It may be kind of generic in what it says, but I want you to look for whatever the passage says about your personal responsibility. I want you to spend just a moment, though, after you find that, to think about what kind of preparation would be needed to be able to do that. So if it tells you you need to be able to do a specific thing, what would you have to have done before that to be actually able to do it well, or to be prepared to do that? If that doesn't make sense to you when you read your passage, raise your hand, I'll come talk to you, and we'll try to figure out a better way of asking the question, but that's what I'd like you to do. If you'll just, for 2 or 3 minutes, examine your passage and think about that, your personal responsibility. You don't have to talk to each other, you can do that, but just think that through, and what preparation you need for that.
Chester's ours is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Ye are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a lamp, put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it shineth into all that are in the house. Even so, let your light shine before men, that you may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven.
It's Matthew 5, Chester.
Yep.
Okay, Steve, you have sat right in between Matthew 5:14 and 1 Peter 2. You can pick either one of those 2 passages and look for what it's saying you should be personally responsible for doing
I
in
would
terms
think
of evangelism,
If an
and what kind
individual
of
has to be a
preparation
light
ought to
in the
be
world,
done by you to be ready to do that.
the group is made up of individuals.
Correct.
And so the group would have to be a light in the world also.
Group would have to be a light in the world, 300%. There's an implication here that actually says, let your light shine, so you have to be willing to be on stage, if you will.
Mhm.
You have to be willing to be overt and transparent about the good things that you're doing. It also implies that you have to be in the world, not out of the world, right?
That's true.
We could all go away and climb up a mountain somewhere and
In a monastery.
Yeah, we could. But that's not really living what the passage says or implies.
Yeah, because you're just, so there's to see your good works.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you can't just kind of shy away and cower with it. What do you think, Chester?
We have to be the best life we can be. But on the Bible, some people never read.
Yeah.
That's true.
How about the preparation part of that? That was part two of the question was, how would we prepare in this context to be that light and to shine in the world?
Try to tell people about Christ.
Yeah, but how would we
Oh.
prepare to do that? What leads up to that? You just don't one day.
Reading the Bible.
Yeah,
Reading
read the
Word.
Bible so we know the word and understand the word. That's good.
I think Hebrews 10, being here, provoking each other to good works and love.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, and we definitely, it's not something you just start, you're here today and tomorrow you started. It's a lifetime of preparation.
I like what you said, Chester, about reading the scripture, because if we think about Christ as the only true light, the only way we come to know Christ is through the scriptures, through the words, and through the things we've learned about. So if we're going to emulate him as lights, we need to read about him and understand who he is. That's the way to prepare to be lights.
All right, I hear some good conversations going on. I appreciate that. You didn't have to discuss with each other, but that's good too. It's even better. That way Teresa doesn't feel alone. She didn't get anybody to talk. She'll know all the answers, trust me. I want to go back through and look at each one of these. And once more, let's think about the idea of the church is going to be involved in teaching other people. How would it do that? What are some ways in which you could look to God's people, church's people, and see that the church is active in terms of teaching the world about Christ? Well, I want to show you at least two ways I think that the scriptures talk about it. The first one is our individual responsibility. Each one of us has some responsibility to have an influence on the world around us. That's what these passages are about, and hopefully you'll explain what they actually say about that responsibility. But in a few moments, when we get past this, we're going to look at what does the church do as a whole? How have we combined our resources? How are we working together as one unit to also do the same thing? And we'll look at some ways in which that happens as well. We're going to talk about ourselves individually and see if we can connect that back to the fact, even though it's us, each one of us on our own, how does that still be viewed as a work of us as a church? That's an interesting question. So let's start with Matthew 5, 14 through 16. Again, the question kind of throughout this is, tell me the individual responsibility, but also what did they do to get ready? How did they become able to do whatever's there? So you guys are up here on the front. You talked about Matthew 5. What does it say we're supposed to do?
We are the light of the world. It's a big
Okay.
responsibility. And I'm assuming since this is talking about individuals and the church is made up of individuals, then the group needs to be the light of the world.
Okay, so go ahead, Steve.
To add to that, you can't just be a light, it has to be a light that shines to others so that they can see, because if you hide it under a bushel, it's not doing any good. It may be lit, but nobody sees it.
All right, so what are they seeing? What does this passage say they're actually seeing?
Good works.
It's their good works. You're actually able to witness what you're doing in life, and that has some effect. And the other part of that, of course, is salt of the earth. You go back into chapter 4 before this sermon gets started. Jesus is out teaching the gospel of the kingdom in verse 23. And then he goes into the Beatitudes. I think he's describing the way that each one of us would be a citizen in that kingdom. How do we conduct ourselves? How do we live? And so all that character that's described in those Beatitudes, now people are actually going to see it. So what kind of preparation is necessary to be a good light?
Studying the Word.
Okay, that's helpful. You would need to know some things about it. But yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Make some, well, you have to make changes in your character.
Yeah, there's actually got to be something that people see. If you think about it, sometimes the more powerful statement might be if you've not lived such a great life. There's no reason to have done that, but somebody that has made a dramatic change in their life could actually stand forth as more of a story, a more vivid sense of a good work now versus what was there before. That would raise questions, and why have you done it? But I do think that what this puts on us is a responsibility to think about the way other people are seeing us. Now, in chapter 6, oddly enough, it actually talks about some good deeds that you're supposed to do, but not let anybody see them. Always thought that's an interesting contrast. Make sure your good works are seen, but when you do these good deeds over here, make sure they're done in secret. The idea is I'm not trying to bring attention to myself, but I do think I need to be aware of how I live, what I say, how I conduct myself, and the impression I'm giving people about who a Christian is, or what it means to be a member of Christ's church. Those things matter. All right, let's go into 1 Peter 2, verse 11 and 12. Everybody can turn there if you want, but those of you that had that one assigned to you, what were you supposed to do? What's the personal responsibility that's there in that passage?
Your conduct honorable among the Gentiles.
Yeah, and Andrew, who do you think that the Gentiles, what does he kind of mean by that phrase, Gentiles there?
We're non-believers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, there would have been Gentile believers, but the way he's using it, he's saying, you as a child of God, this is about how you live among those who are not believers. Live honorably. What else is in there? What other responsibilities? Are there others?
To abstain from the passion.
Yeah, so it's back to those good works, but now kind of a specific thing about what kind of changes you've made, what you're not doing, what stands out maybe different than the way they would have. Steve?
In the description itself, I heard you as sojourners and exiles, so it's not like we're supposed to be making a permanent home here, we're thinking ahead.
So it's a little bit of a mindset, right? And I think, again, that goes back to similar preparation that you might have seen there in the Matthew 5 passage, an awareness of others that you're working with, you're associating with, how they would see you, what they would think about it, making sure that you are abstaining from things that you shouldn't be involved in, being careful about that. Does it say much here about what you necessarily say? What is making the statement as much as anything in 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12? It's your conduct. So, now, we'll talk in a moment about some things you might say, but here I think it's more about your conduct among them and what that might bring. And it implies that at times that conduct will be meaningful to them and would cause them eventually to come and glorify God, or whatever that day of visitation may be. Third group, 1 Peter, the next chapter, verse 15. What are you supposed to be able to do? What are you expected to be capable of? All right, say that again.
Giving a defense for your.
Yeah, give a defense of your belief. To whom?
Whoever asks.
To anybody that comes and asks, which kind of implies that some of your conduct and other things might lead to some questions. But what about the preparation side of this?
So on your hearts, Christ is Lord.
Okay, so that's good. That comes back to some of the same thing we've been talking about, that you're living the right way, you're dedicated the right way. There's something else here too, because he didn't just say answer, he said
You have to be prepared to make a defense.
prepared. You're ready. Do you think that means sometimes you kind of have to think through in your mind, if somebody ever asked me about this, or somebody has started to question so-and-so of my beliefs, man, I need to think that through. How would I answer that? Why do I believe in this? Why do I practice these things? We need to understand why we do what we do and be ready to make some type of defense of it. Okay, last one, Acts 8, 1 through 4. Now, this is more of an example of something that happened. But what happened here? What was the individual thing that happened? Or maybe I'll ask you a little different question, those of you that were in Acts 8. What's the event that's going on as the chapter opens up here in Acts chapter 8?
So I'll start first Peter.
Okay, so at that time known as Saul, later becomes the Apostle Paul. Saul is actively trying to stop people who believe in Christ. And he brings this great persecution on the church. How intense is the persecution that happens there at the beginning part of Acts chapter 8? What are some of the results, I should say, of that persecution?
Scatter everywhere.
People get scattered out of the city of Jerusalem, where most of them have been, so they're kind of concentrated there. Now they get scattered off, away from their home. I take it they're away from each other, but I don't have a picture of if there were 5,000 plus Christians or more than that, probably by that point, but at least that number are mentioned in the previous chapters. I don't get the impression like the 5,000 all went off into 5,000 different locations, but they are scattered. What does verse 4 say that they did, those that were scattered? They preached the word. Now, if you think about your New Testament, and I said to you, name 4 or 5 men that were out preaching the word throughout the book of the New Testament, who comes to mind?
Stephen.
There's one.
Philip.
Philip, Paul,
Peter.
Titus. So you've named to me some apostles. You've named some of those prominent men that were selected in Acts chapter 6. You even named some of those evangelists to get letters written to them, so their names end up on those letters. These are all pretty prominent individuals. You can think of men who are out and they're preaching, and you see a lot of training behind that. Certainly do the apostles. And you think about what was said of those 6 men and or 7 men, I think it is in Acts chapter 6. And then Titus is being told certain things from Paul. There's a lot of training and all that. And yet now we have thousands who are out and they're able to preach. How did they ever get ready to preach? How did that happen? That all those were able to go out and preach the gospel. What had they done to get ready?
Acts 2.
Acts 2,
Yeah.
you say. All right, look over at Acts 2. I think that's an important passage. Acts 2, verse 42 is some of what was going on in the church there. And here's at least part of the preparation, but I want you to see more than this one, but I think this one is especially a good place to start. What verse do you have in mind, Ken?
42.
42. Okay, listen to this. This is what happened to these men and women before they went out and preached everywhere. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. So here's part of their preparation was they were listening to the apostles and they were learning. They'd been taught. What else was happening in that church? And before you get to Acts chapter 8, tell me some other things you know about the church there in Jerusalem before we get to this.
Making alms and selling everything that they had.
Why were they doing that? Why were they selling everything? Some of them.
There were an awful lot of people there from other places, and they need to be taken care of, and fed and housed.
They were in need, so that instead of being left in need, others were selling what they had. They were giving to them. They were sharing those things in common along the way. What else do you know about them, even in Acts chapter 2?
They had all things in common.
Okay, that's the same thing. We're just talking about they had these things in common. You notice down in, look at verse 46. Day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes. They received their food with glad and generous hearts. So they were together in worship. All of them got together and worshiped. But what else did they do? Were they only together when they got together for worship? Yeah, they were in each other's homes. They had relationships. They were building. All the things we've been talking about in the 3 lessons before this, I think, had prepared them to go out and teach the gospel. They were being built up and edified by learning from the apostles' doctrine. We talked about the value of the word to build you up. You have a point?
Well, so I'm struck by the fact that at the end of verse, in that chapter 8, the end of verse, okay, verse 2, they were scattered except the apostles.
Yes.
So it wasn't like each little group
Thank
of
you.
apostles were with them. So that would be probably a little scary to feel like, oh, I'm off on my own, except for not only have they been with the apostles and listened to their teaching, but you think about in Acts chapter 3, in Acts chapter 4, they had watched these apostles be arrested.
Yes.
And they saw the courage and the determination to keep on preaching no matter what's going to happen. So here these folks they have suffered persecution, and they must have thought back to when Peter and John were arrested and others, and thought, if they can do it, and
Very
not
good.
just, this is about me going to do it, but how can I not tell whoever I'm with the things that I know? So kind of the importance of their company.
It's good, Steve. Rosette.
Along those same lines where, I think it's easy when we think about preaching, to think about a very formal setting where one person is boldly proclaiming God's word. But there's an element in this which is just sort of a one-on-one, I'm telling you the good news. I'm telling you the greatest news I've ever heard. And it's less formal, and it's, I think, more useful in the types of settings that they were probably in.
Good. Steve, you had a point?
I was gonna go along with that, because they were eyewitnesses of a lot of things that happened right there in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's
Just-
good, yeah.
Just going out and saying, hey, this is what happened in Jerusalem, so they could have, other people could have a better understanding.
All these are really good. What I'm really struck by is the idea that they went out and did it during a period of persecution. It wasn't easy. You've been scattered from your home. You've been driven out of your city. You're going to another place. And I've tried to think about how much courage would it take for me to be able to then tell people about Christ when my faith is what's costing me, maybe my livelihood, my residence, whatever it is that I'm giving up, being scattered. I don't think that's possible unless you have strong relationships. Okay, the picture here in my mind is not that they just went off on their own, went to another city all by themselves and started preaching anybody they found. That, clusters of them end up in different places. And do you think when they did that they clung to each other? And you think they felt a sense of responsibility? Man, if the two Steves over here are doing it, then I better do it too. If Katie's teaching, then and if she's standing up for her faith, even though she's being persecuted, then I need to do some of that too. I think those relationships they built made them capable of having the spirit and courage to teach. They had the knowledge because they had been together, they had listened to the apostles, they had learned things, they'd watched their examples, and all. Now they're equipped. And remember, that's the whole point of the church, and the inward purpose is that we are equipped by the leaders, by one another, by what everybody does, that the church builds itself up in love. I think that's what happened in Jerusalem, and then they were ready, really, for the outward purpose. Steve, then Kate.
When I was little, we had a chance to go through Europe, and we stopped in places like Yugoslavia and Italy and things. And we learned there that a lot of the Christians met in caves, in secret and things like that. And like
Back in the beginning days of the
Right.
church. Right.
It would have been scary, and anything that they had done would have drawn attention to themselves to be more persecuted, but yet despite that, they did what they could to get together. That just shows a lot of courage and strength.
I think that's very good. Okay.
So when I read this, the Katie and I were talking, like, my tendency would be, rather just hunker down and stay with these Christians, not let other people know,
Right.
what we're about, because like, what if they, I gotta protect my kids, and that would be me, but that's not what they do.
And so there must have been something too about just sort of that fervency, just to kind of built up within them, just this almost need to say something about Christ. And we need to generate that. I don't know that we, and I'm talking about we as leaders here, maybe put enough attention. A lot of times these days we're very much caught up. We got a lot of things going on within the church here. We got to take care of those things. We got to deal with them. But we need to be thinking often about how to build up this spirit of wanting to tell others about Christ and making sure that that's important, because it's that I think they just did it naturally from their heart, because the personal inclination or the natural inclination would be what you just said. We're under persecution, hunker down, don't let anybody know about that. I want to move on. We talk about a different kind of involvement that the church has. The first one, again, I think even though it's maybe individuals, I just don't think you can be prepared to do this well unless you are participating in fellowship with a church that is building you up, and you're building them up, and you're learning things and preparing and getting your spirit built up in your relationships that allow you as on your own with those around you to teach them the gospel. There's another way in which we can, as a church, be involved, and that is, if you think back, this is part of lesson 7. I don't think I really covered this very well. I think we ran out of time, so it's kind of nice that I get to circle back around and make up for my past mistakes in teaching. Here were some things to think about evangelists, a picture of what you get from the New Testament. One was, if you had all these men, and y'all mentioned even some others that are not on this list, that were known to be preachers or proclaimers of the word. And what often happened was they would go to places where there were no churches and no previous knowledge about Christ. Give me an example of where somebody like these men would go somewhere where the gospel had not been taught before. People didn't even know maybe who this Jesus was. Athens, and who's doing that?
Paul.
It's Paul. Yeah, a lot of them you can think of, it's Paul on those missionary journeys as he goes forth. But he didn't go alone even. You had Barnabas on one journey, and you had Silas on maybe more than that. They usually picked up others who went with them. And then it seems as if they even sent them out. You got Philip. Remember Philip in Acts 8? He goes up to Samaria and preaches. So it's not unusual that somebody would go where the gospel had not been taught before. But there were times when they stopped and they stayed for an extended period of time in a certain place. And what I've pictured here, from what you can tell in those passages, part of what they would have done would be that they would have built up the Christians that were already there. You know, just like in Acts chapter 2, talking about the apostles in Jerusalem, they're teaching new people about Christ, but those who've already believed, they were learning the apostles' doctrine. They were learning from the apostles. So no question that on these occasions when Paul stayed for, anybody know how long he stayed in Corinth?
Year and a half.
It's a year and a half, 3 years in Ephesus. During those times, he was really teaching the Christians, but that's not all that he did. He seems to indicate in Ephesus that the gospel was being spread out all around the regions from Ephesus while he was there. So I picture them as kind of doing some of that second bullet point. There were some places around maybe where the gospel had been taught, but now they're also building them up. Timothy, we know, was in Ephesus because Paul writes to him, and he's there in Ephesus. And no question by that point, there's already a church established in Ephesus, and he's telling him the kind of work that he should do as an evangelist among where there are Christians already. But oftentimes they're out preaching the gospel. And by the way, one other place where Paul was besides Corinth and Ephesus, we'll talk about in just a moment. Do you know any other place where he settled down for at least some period of time?
It says it in Galatians.
That's it. In Antioch. We'll come back and take a look at Antioch in a moment. They were financially supported by churches. And we see ways in which they were provided with fellowship and oftentimes even financial things were sent to them. And Paul talked about the fact that it was perfectly appropriate for a man who was teaching the word to be able to be fed and earn a living by the fact that he was doing that. Talking about like an ox not being muzzled. I like to suggest there's two models of the way that they did this. They're not in opposition to each other. They're just slight nuances about the way that two different churches had fellowship and involvement with the evangelists who were going out and doing some of these things here that are above that. One would be Philippi. I think that's pretty familiar. Look at chapter 4 of the book of Philippians. You may be familiar with this picture of what they did. Philippians 4, verses 15 through 18. Paul said to the Philippians, "You Philippians know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again." That's an interesting thing because Thessalonica was the very next city Paul went to after he first went to Philippi there in Acts chapter 16. He says, "Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I'm well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God." Philippians 4 is written when Paul is in prison, most likely in Rome, way later than when those events take place in Acts chapter 16, when he first comes and starts a church there in Philippi. So he is saying that, Philippians, you've been giving to me and providing for my needs for a very long period of time. And this Epaphroditus was a member of the church there in Philippi who had come to Rome to provide even once more, whatever that may be that Paul needed. So there's a support model of where a church is sending money to an evangelist, a preacher, somewhere else, and even staying involved with him wherever he may go over a period of time. But they're supporting the man and making sure that he is able to go out and preach the word. You understand that model? I think Antioch is it's a little bit different. It's also about Paul. But if you would, open up to Acts chapter 11. And let's just very quickly get a sense of what's going on in Antioch with Paul and the church there. You know, Antioch was a fascinating church because it's like the first church where you know that Gentiles are being converted. You got Cornelius being converted. It doesn't say a whole lot more what happens in the city where he is. His family's converted and all. But people began to teach the Gentiles in Antioch, and there's conversions in great numbers. And the church gets started there. Acts chapter 11. Barnabas goes up to Tarsus to look for Saul because he realizes here we got this great opportunity. We all need to go to work down in Antioch and get busy. And he brings him there. And look at verse 26 of chapter 11. For a whole year, they met with the church, taught a great many people, and in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. So here you got Paul in Antioch for over a year, working. He's not the only one, Barnabas as well. In fact, in Acts chapter 13, look at the first couple of verses there. Now you see that in the church at Antioch, there are prophets and teachers, and it doesn't just mention Paul and Barnabas. You got Barnabas, Simeon, Lucius, Manaen, and Saul. And so you've got a church full of teachers and all. In Acts chapter 13, the Holy Spirit says, I want you to take Paul and Barnabas, and he's going to send them off. And so in Acts chapter 13, you have the first missionary journey. And so now you have one of these places where that church in Antioch puts their hands, fellowship, meet with Paul. The Holy Spirit says to go. We're all behind it. And Paul and Barnabas go off and teach. What did they do when they got back? Where did they go when they finished that first missionary journey? Back to Antioch. If you look at Acts chapter 14, the next chapter, this is sometime later, verse 26, when they had sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled, and when they arrived, they gathered the church together. The whole church of Antioch gets together, listens to the report that these two men had to say, and then in verse 28, they remained no little time with the disciples. I love that picture. We don't think about that a lot. Here's one in which the church in Antioch sends off these men, and then when they're done with their mission somewhere else, they come back. They spent at least a year before. They spent no little time after they got back, but in between they went off on this journey. You know. Slightly different than Philippi, where Paul just was basically hardly ever there after traveling through the first time. I like to suggest to you that that's the way the work is here. I asked you this earlier about who we support. I'm going to come back to that question in a minute. But I think in some ways that we are like Philippi. How are we like Philippi in terms of the way we might support somebody who's preaching the gospel?
We support a lot of men that will never be here, part of us.
Yeah, there's some men, when we put the list up in a moment, a lot of you have never met them. In fact, I didn't think about this ahead of time. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a name or two on there that Ken and I have never met.
Probably not.
We'll think that through in a moment. But so there's some, perhaps you haven't. What else about them is fitting to this Philippi picture? Men we support. What?
Financial support.
Yeah, we have sent them financial support so they're able to do the work oftentimes in places where they wouldn't have enough support if we did not do that. And sometimes there are men that have changed their work up somewhat over time, or even the place where they went, and we've continued to support them in other places because we were already committed to the man and to the work that he was doing. Can you think about somebody that we were supporting recently in one place and decided to go somewhere else? Yeah. And we might think of him under both models, but I think it fits a little bit of that. We're committed to the man and his work. We want to continue to see him do well, and he's going to a place where he's not able to be supported. We want to be a part of that kind of work. Anything else about Philippi? What about Antioch, though? Can you think of some ways in which this church has been involved with the gospel being taught, much like the church in Antioch, where there were men that were there, and then they went off somewhere else and they came back, but there was this still connection with them?
Matt Qualls.
All right, explain, because a lot of us don't know who Matt Qualls is.
Matt was in England. We supported him for a good long time. And
Okay.
when time come back, we decided it would be a good landing place for him to come back here.
And he came here and preached here in Atlanta for a number of years.
Yes, for a number of years, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. What else? Other ways? Can you think of some other ones? Rod, you're nodding. You must have somebody.
You come at other people, Sewell was in that description.
Yeah, so I mean, here's Sewell Hall, who's one of our elders, and he just gets this idea. Most folks in their 70s figure living for a while in Manhattan, no big deal, just make a life change. Run on up there, preach the gospel to a lot of folks, and all. And he did. And we supported him the whole time that he was there. And then he came back, and once more supported here, almost very much like the picture there that you have.
But even before, for the
Yeah.
20 years or whatever, before he left and went to New York, he was here, and this was his residence, but he would go to Europe for, a couple months at a time and come back and be here for a good amount of time, and he might go, somewhere else for 6 weeks.
Yeah, I want you to think about that. And I want you to try to remember, those of you who've been here for a while, beyond even Sewell doing what Kay just described. But he was always on the go. To Europe, to Africa, to other parts of the United States where people wanted him to come and preach in a meeting here or do some special work there. Again, as if, working in Manhattan for a while wasn't enough. He goes to Sierra Leone, about the same age and all, out on scooters and stuff. Just constantly in other places. Well, do we have fellowship in that? And I would argue that even if we didn't support him financially, if he was a part of the group here and was encouraged to do that, you've got some of that same kind of involvement in that evangelism. But in his case, of course, we did support him. Every evangelist I could think of that we've had that we have supported here to help us and building us up and doing that work, we've also encouraged them to go in other places and teach the gospel. Jim Jonas went to South Africa. Ben went to Sierra Leone. David Maxson went to China. That's right. Bill has gone to Mexico. And going to Costa Rica tomorrow. And so you can think of the way that's been done with those we think of in a more kind of formal basis. But then I get to thinking about all those men and women that have been here, that have had opportunity to travel and went and encourage Christians or evangelists even in other places. I think about a Martin Broadwell, who through the years, and Marty's dad, if you didn't know Martin, Martin traveled on business for a long time, and he would very much try to end up being in a place like Germany, where Glenn Jones is, that we support. It means the world to an evangelist if you can show up. If you've ever been able on a vacation or something to show up where we support somebody, trust me, if you get a chance, it'll encourage you, but it encourages them. And then we have all kinds of teachers and preachers from here that are not supported by this church, but end up preaching in all kinds of places. Places like Shooting Creek, or over at Rockdale and Conyers, or a number of men are asked to end up in different places preaching. All that is a work of this congregation because, say again, is because of the equipping that we're all doing to each other. It's the relationships, it's the knowledge, it's being together on nights like tonight, where we're learning and thinking, we're equipping each other to be able to do this. And as a result, I can think about churches all over the world where members from here have gone to either encourage or to teach people the gospel, including the lost. And I think that says a lot about this outward work that's beyond us in places like Indiana.
One thing about Richard Shennis.
Yes, because Richard is another one of those kind of men who've used his vacation time, used his own personal funds to be sure he could go somewhere where we were supporting somebody like a Robin Bauer in South Africa, and did that. And that's another good name. Now, we could go, I mean, when I put these notes together before, I couldn't think of everybody. And then the class came up like that with even more names I hadn't even thought of along the way. It's a very wonderful work that's being done. A couple of things, if you look over at the deacon duty, if you have Appendix A, I just want to mention a couple of these. And I'll put this on the board just so you can say that you saw where all those men are. I mean, here's one I have not met. I'm not sure any of us have ever met Arturo. We would like to bring Arturo here, and we can't do it. There's a lot of immigration and other things. Even to bring him here on a temporary basis has been a huge stumbling block. We would like to have him come here. So I've never met Arturo, but we know much about him. We no longer support JD. I need to kind of fix that part of it. He moved on to another work and not me our support. Here's some things though. If you look at 5A, the treasurer has a lot to do with our evangelistic effort. Who do you think keeps up with, make sure that these men get paid on time, that they're not worried about those sorts of things? If we didn't have men like Grady doing that, that could be a big issue. Look at number 10. There's evangelism. There's actually a deacon responsible for organizing things, getting us all involved. Remember those home studies that were done not too many months back? That was a result of some of those working together with members here and others to organize and get that ready so that the rest of us was kind of equipping us. So the actual work was not really done that much by the deacons or others that they got involved in that. It was done by the rest who had them in their home, did some of the teaching. Look at number 11, just simply keeping us informed of how many studies are out there. There are meetup studies in different places that you can go and participate. If you want to know where those are, there's a list maintained. It's probably never fully up to date, but that's a work that's done to try to give us information about how we could participate in that. Look at number 18, the advertisement, the flyers and things that are done before gospel meeting, things you can hand out, put on the bulletin board at work, what's on the sign outside. That sign outside is rarely meant for us, to remind us. I think most of us know whatever it says. It's meant to draw attention into the neighborhood so that somebody like a James Newman, one of our elders, who one day passed by and saw a sign and thought, I wonder what's going on down there in that building, and came down here and learned about Christ. And now, as a result of that, years and years later, it's just a wonderful man serving us as an elder. There's some others too, I think 25, bar evangelism, somebody keeping up with all those. And do our group meetings. You are, if you remember. Every other time your group meets together, you are focused on evangelistic efforts of those that come and visit with us. So, a lot of different ways here to be involved in salvation. Thank you for 2 more lessons to go. We're going to look at the upward purpose over the next couple of lessons.
I've never met Dan Peters.
Nor have I. That's I didn't catch that one. You're right.
Transportation.
Well, that's a good point, because it's not always just members. Sometimes it's those that have some interest.
All right, good.
Oh, yeah?
Share button. Mute mic cancel button. Finish button.
Excuse me. Tom make it tonight?
Yeah.
Great.
Usually he calls. 50 minutes, 38 seconds. Finish. Button. Finish. Button. Finish.